And we are back with episode 3 now of the SAD2 build series. Hi, my name is Steve. Welcome to Figure It Audi if this is your first time joining. And this is a project on this 2001 Audi S8 that I bought from across Canada. If you want to go back and watch the last 2 episodes, there's the playlist link right there. Also, as I always say, please like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Find me on Instagram at Figure It Audi. And if you want, hit the notification bell so that you can get notified when new stuff comes out on the channel. I have a small favor to ask of you, but you have a chance to name the vanity plate that's going to go on the back of this car. So I want to get another plate just like I did for the S4, but something more specific to the S8. And you'll see in the poll, I have a couple of good ideas that I like right now, but I want to hear some of your comments too. And then eventually I will pick one of those options and put it on the car. No more long talk. We're going to get straight into the project today. The goal is to separate the engine from the transmission. I'm going to start just by getting the wiring harness out of the way and a few little accessories that are going to sort of bother me. Then get it up on a stand. We're going to do the full engine teardown in this video, and I'm going to show you exactly everything that I find. And then hopefully by the end of this episode, the block won't even be here because it's off to the machine shop. I'm about to suit up and get into a quick time lapse for you, but in the background, I'm actually going to be listening to something I wanted to suggest to you, Car Talk. It is an old radio show that was on NPR about 30 years ago with Click and Clack, the Tappet brothers. They are mechanics by trade. They're out in the Boston area, and they just give people hilarious and really good advice about their cars and just talk about car stuff. It's kind of funny to listen to them. They're super smart guys. And just hear what's changed over the last, 3 decades worth of time in the automotive space. And if you had any other comments about like really good automotive content or podcasts that you listen to, put them in the comments too. The engine harness was almost already detached because of the previous episode's work, except for the speed sensor that was on the side of the transmission, which also required me to take off of the cooling lines that run into the transmission. Once those were out of the way, I went on a mission to remove everything related to coolant. So the hard water pipe on the back came off, but then I realized how many other lines that pipe fed. And I started to tackle the one that I saw running behind the passenger side exhaust manifold. And this was actually the first exhaust manifold I've ever taken off of an engine, so I was trying to take extra care using lots of heat penetrating oil the day before. Wasn't a big deal, and then I could lift up the engine and get to work on the engine mount that was beside it, also because that's what blocks you from removing the starter, which is what I'm working on here. With those items out of the way, I could go back up top, get rid of that last cooling line, the NOx sensor, and some of the PCV piping. Rinse and repeat for the driver's side, one more engine mount on that side, and removing of the exhaust manifold, and all in all, I only accidentally backed out 1 stud per exhaust manifold. That was a lot of work. Granted, I've been really busy at work, and I've been trying to slip in hours where I can get them on the evenings and weekends. It's like the middle of February now. Anyways, now that the engine and the transmission are completely broken down from all that stuff you saw me take apart, it's kind of cool because we get to see 2 things. One, where the leaks were everywhere, as the Coles notes on that one. And again, more engineering decisions over time as we see the power plant here of the 4.2 move from a front belt-driven system to the rear chain-driven system like I have in the S4. For the 3 people out there watching that still have a car like this, whether it's a D2 chassis or maybe the C5 S6, and you have this enormous 5-speed get rag, take a look at the O-rings that go inside the ports right here for the cooler lines for the automatic transmission. Mine were definitely blown out. That is why there's a nice big oval of grease that's sprayed in both directions. This was just a nightmare getting all this stuff apart. What's fun about this for me is that I know very little about transmissions, and stripping down the side of this has taught me a couple things already. I know like kind of zero about automatic transmissions and a slight more about manuals, but I just wanted to show you something. This right here is how you switch gears. So you probably don't put a lot of thought into what's happening under the car when you have your hand, you depress the button on your automatic gear shifter and you shift it into a different stage, right? Well, it's just attached to a cable under the car, and all it's doing is acting on this little thing right here. So if I have this correctly, I believe this is in 2nd gear right now. That's 3rd, and as you keep moving it, 4th, I believe that's drive, and then I think that might be neutral or reverse, other neutral or reverse, and that's park right there. So that's kind of all there is to it. The only other cool piece of the puzzle I wanted to show you was this component right here. It is electrically monitored, and I believe what it's called is a neutral lockout switch. I think the point of it is just to monitor what gear you're in and make sure that you can't, I don't know if it's stop or start, or maybe both, the car if you're in neutral. The other thing I want to show you is everything about coolant, and this is just kind of insane. Look how rusty this is. It is so rusty that the plastic coolant temperature sensor at the top in green there is rusted into place. It's plastic though. Like, How does that work? What's the science behind that? I still have yet to put a wrench on there and try to break it out, but I just find it insane that a plastic C-clip can rust to metal. What was kind of crazy though was that in addition to the giant water line that I am familiar with, it's on the chain-driven cars too, this one has huge ports on the back of the heads, but it has a secondary water line that comes off of the main big hard line, and it also feeds the other side of the head too. So there's a pipe that comes in through here and has an entry point right here, and likewise there is a matching one on the opposite end of the head on the driver's side right there too. Additionally, it branches off down the side here, wraps under the intake manifold, under the engine mount, and it goes in right here actually. So I believe this is cooling the oil. This is sort of like an internal oil cooler, I think, back in here. We'll find out pretty shortly, but there is coolant running all around this block. But wait, there's actually one more coolant line, and this one is a throw your car away if you have to work on this type of situation, because it actually holds the passenger side knock sensor in so tight, you would have to take the entire thing apart to get at it. So there is this hole that goes to the front of the block, and there's a press fit line with an O-ring of a coolant tube that goes all the way here and also joins back to all that water stuff right there. But it actually pinches in the knock sensor electronic line right here, and you can't pull out your knock sensor without taking off like your intake manifold, which of course takes other work, and then taking apart the cooling system, and you'd never be able to do that because of how the hoses are run in the back. It's like an engine out knock sensor replacement. I was shocked to find how much dried up blow-by was stuck in my PVC system too. I would say about 30% of the passageways were plugged with dried up blow-by, and if you think your high mileage engine is clean, well, you might want to guess again. What's becoming really fun for me is figuring out when I'm going to run out of pine cones and acorns in this engine. And I thought I pulled out the last one, but I can see that there's a full-size pine cone in here that I won't be able to get until I take off the power steering pump. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and finally separate the transmission from the block. Now this is going to be one of those things where on paper it's pretty darn easy, because really all you're talking about is a half dozen or so 16mm bolts that are holding the transmission to the back of the block. And then you've actually got some kind of weird ones that are tucked around underneath in the long extension oil pan right here. And I've already got a socket fitted up to one of the only two, I think it's a H8 size hex bolts that also go in this direction. The one on this side's already out because you actually needed to take out the starter. So because I'm a bad YouTuber and I'm gonna start where you can't see me working, I'm just gonna knock out this one over here. I love working on the cold floor. What you're listening to is me hammering on just a little hex key right here, because you actually can't get a socket in. There's no depth behind this fastener, so I'm praying that this comes loose here. That big snap, hopefully, was it breaking loose? Let's see. Yeah, all right. Now, while this is hanging up in the air, I'll take advantage of the space and just crack loose the two more on the bottom. I don't know about you guys, but back when I was first kind of starting to get into cars, I didn't really understand why mechanics needed so many tools of what was essentially the same thing. Like, why would you need a 16mm socket in a regular and a deep and in quarter and 3/16 or half-inch drive or even more than that? Well, because you just do. And I think you can tell my game plan here is to get the ones out on the bottom. I'm gonna lower this in a second. Pretty much put it on my furniture dolly, exactly where it needs to line up to be held properly under the transmission. And then we're gonna go ahead and try to separate them. Apologies if I'm being a little sniffly when I'm talking. Usually when it's winter here, I don't want to ultra heat the garage because it's kind of expensive. And I usually work in about 13 to 15 degrees Celsius temperature in here. Jack is no longer required. I've done well. I should mention that I've had these big bolts soaking in penetrating oil for at least a day now. So this happened. I just learned, very unfortunately, that my nice camera that I'm using in cases like this, it stops recording after 30 minutes. So at about 32 minutes, I was working away and I got the transmission off. I had a great time, congratulated myself very much. And it was really easy too, when the engine and transmission don't really have any tension on one another and they're all at the same height, other than the fact that there is an alignment dowel on the top right and the bottom left. All I did was stand back here, gave it a wiggle, had some pry bars out on the kind of rough areas of the casting here, and it just came right off. Obviously there's a bunch of fluid that comes out of the torque converter when you do that, so I'm all good there. And according to the documentation, all I need to do now is rotate the engine over to TDC, and apparently if I look through the starter hole right here, there are some alignment marks, and you have to mark up what they call drive plate to the torque converter to make sure that when you try to put it all back together, it actually lines up on, I think, either keyways on the back part of the shaft here or something. I don't know, I'm learning as I go. So I will figure out those marks and mark them up right now. Thanks to those of you who answered my call on Instagram and helped me understand that the central bolt here that runs through the vibration dampener is a 24 millimeter. So now I have one of those and I can turn the engine over, and I have found TDC, but there are some very interesting things I just found out and I want to share some tips with you right now. It's been a lesson learned for me that you can't trust markings that somebody put on the outside of your pulley, because I am not in time right now. Also, I wasn't sure if I could trust this little kind of weird looking notch in the timing cover that is turning out to be TDC, but I'm not in time right now. Now, up until literally 10 minutes ago, I had thought that universally TDC was always in reference to cylinder number 1. And I've now found out that on these 4.2 motors, and I think that's even applicable to the chain-driven ones too, it's not, it's cylinder 5. So if you were looking to put the screwdriver into the spark plug hole and do the old trick to see if it goes up and down on cylinder 1, you'd be wrong. It's actually this one on the driver's side right here. Additionally, check out the cam sprocket. There are 2 holes here and they are not the same size. This one is oblong and kind of skinny. This one's a little bit bigger. You need to turn them until the big holes are pointing at each other. But obviously that's still not foolproof because 2 turns equals 1 turn. So let me just put this into cam time and then we'll look at one more factor. Okay, see how these look now? Well, wouldn't you know it, look at this. New markings have appeared, little notches on the front and the back that now line up with this timing mark. That is a great sign, but there's still one more thing to look at. If you've ever looked into doing your own timing job on your V8 before, you've probably noticed one of these factory tools. This is factory tool 3242 in a workshop manual, and it says you need one of these to put it into the crank in the bottom to hold the whole assembly still. And that is absolutely true. So if we're right and we've rotated everything correctly, I should be able to look up into the access port on the side of the block and see a little notch where the bullnose end of this tool goes into. Down on the driver's side of the block, in this hole, I have taken out what is going to look like a oil drain plug. And when you look in there, and this is going to be a crazy angle for you, there it is. There is the hole to take on the tool in the crank. So now that I know I'm in time, I'll put that tool in and I should be able to go look in that starter hole and figure out what the markings need to be on the torque converter. I think I just had a minor screw up, but in the long run, I think I'll be okay. So we did that TDC work because of the specific step that says, when engine is detached from gearbox, turn engine over to TDC and align the marking on the gearbox bell housing with the marking on the torque converter. So yeah, they're detached, engine, transmission, but now that I actually look at the markings on here, what I found is that it's talking about this little metal rectangle that's on the outside of the torque converter right here, down by the 3rd bolt hole. Well, not so coincidentally, there is a viewing window in that exact spot right here. So I think what it's actually meaning to say is that when the gearbox is ready to come off the back of the block, rotate the engine to TDC, at which point you should see the marking of the torque converter in there, at which point the entire gearbox and your engine is in time at TDC, then take it off. I think it's okay though, because there is just a little fork on the back of the torque converter, and it should be pretty darn easy to rotate this later and find its way back into the gearbox. So I think really the important part here is just making sure you understand the TDC alignment of your torque converter and all these other spinning things right here, because we're about to take it all apart. So I'm going to mark it up in a few spots because I honestly don't really know where I can do it or how I should be doing it. So I'll just do a couple and you know, cross our fingers in the future. Psych, I am not taking off the torque converter right now because I need a T55 torque socket to get into the fasteners holding it to the flywheel, and I only have up to a T50. While I go find one of those, I'm going to just go ahead and remove the valve covers. After about 2 fasteners, I found every other one to be caked with grease and sand, so I had to individually clean them out by hand before I could get my bit in there to make sure I had proper contact. So eventually got that done, got the first valve cover off. And technically, this is one of those processes where the workshop manual tells you you need to remove the fasteners in a certain order, just like you would normally torque one down, but I didn't find that that mattered. Good news, things are in a little bit better condition than I thought they might be. A little bit of damage here and there, I'll show you in a second, but it's encouraging. This is also a good time where you can sort of read the grease on the block. Once the valve cover is off, you can really see where it was overspraying, and I can tell now that a weakness is going to be around the tensioners. So on the back of the passenger side head, you can see there's tons of grease right here, right where the tensioner is. And then there is a matching overspray of grease up at the front where the tensioner is on the driver's side. What I really love about this part of a project, once you get to see the valve train, you get to really understand how the engine works in its entirety. I think it's super cool, so I just wanted to show you what it's like right now. So let's look at the timing in the front. In very simplistic terms, you can see that the timing belt only really goes to 2 things, sort of 3, because we have the water pump in the front. But really the belt coming off the sprocket behind the damper right here is only going to 2 sprockets, and they both drive the exhaust cams on both sides. So when we follow it back, we can see the exhaust cam, and it's got huge lobes on it, but only a single lobe for each cylinder. And so that is actuating 2 exhaust valves under there. When you compare it to the intake cam, where it's got 2 skinnier lobes, and those are working 3 intake valves on that side. But when you travel to the back of the exhaust cam, that's when we get to the mechanical connection between the 2 cams. So it is chain driven from exhaust to intake, and the tension is applied via tensioner. And I believe the tension is provided by oil pressure, and there is a solenoid that's usually there. I took this one off. You can see this one's still on over here. And I believe that solenoid doesn't really do anything. Potentially it monitors the oil pressure or has a way to manipulate it. But as far as I can tell, these engines are not variable timing. They are simply just mechanically linked through the chain, and your timing is your timing. So now if you continue on to the intake cam, you go all the way back to the front, and there is a position sensor right here. But what's interesting is that the opposite is true on the other bank. So although, yes, there's a sprocket running the exhaust cam, this time the connection is at the front, not the back. And it's connected to the intake cam, follow it to the back, and once again there is a sensor. So that's kind of it. That's why it's so cool to see this stuff. It's actually pretty simple when you look at it. I don't know why the banks are asymmetrical in how the valve trains are run. Maybe it is a part of balance, or it was a necessity out of the design of the block. I don't really know, but it really does make sense when you look at it. I noticed something kind of interesting about the design of the cam caps, or the girdles. I don't really know what the technical term is, but when I looked at this here, notice how when you look at how the cams are strapped down into the head, you know, these ones aren't connected to each other. These are not connected to each other. These aren't. But look here, whenever it's closest to the tensioner, this cam bridge is completely connected to one another. This is one piece, and there's some sort of like structural design here to make sure that there's a lot of tension being put closest to the tensioner. And maybe that's because there's actually tension through the chain, actually kind of like pushing down on this side of the cams. And in order to hold it really still, I'm just guessing, they needed extra support up here towards the front, and back here it was less of an issue. But by far the most important thing that I wanted to look at was the condition of the guide on the tensioners. You can see in these better pictures here that they are worn. There is a groove that I would say is maybe a millimeter deep, and you can see that the chain links are actually settled down into the guide a little bit. I wouldn't say it's super concerning. Obviously it's not ideal. They're totally flat on the top when they come new from the factory, but at least it's not cracked, and I'll have to decide whether I'm comfortable reusing these or not. Now finally, with the T55 torque socket in hand, I was easily able to roll over the engine and access the 3 bolts on the back of the drive plate with that Torx head in it, so I could remove the torque converter, which popped right out, no problem. Then I took off the bolts holding the drive plate to the back of the crank, and there were a few shims involved there too. Now it was this next part that really threw me for a loop, and it burned a day and a half of my time, my engine stand bracket that I'm mounting to the back of the block wouldn't fit. I had the style with slots in it, you can see, where you can move around the arms and hopefully reach whatever bolt pickup point that you need to use on the back of the block. But no matter what orientation I used, it just wouldn't fit, and I determined that I was going to need to drill 2 new holes to make sure I could get those top 2 arms to fit. So I got to work using my new Bosch drill bits that I picked up in the previous episode to help me with rusted fasteners, and I made some mistakes. Admittedly, this is not the type of work that I do very often. I obviously don't have a drill press to make this safe and easy, and I realized that it's actually pretty dangerous to punch a drill bit through a piece of steel like this because it does catch the metal on the way out the other side, and that's when it torqued back against my arm a few times, which kind of hurt, honestly. So I got a little better on the second hole, started with a smaller bit, worked my way up. I flipped around the bracket a few times to make sure that I was cutting into fresh steel each time, and I finished the hole with my rotary tool and a file to make sure that I wasn't going to hurt myself, and that, of course, my bracket fit the bolts. I'm on the verge of victory of finally picking this engine up off of the tire. This is going to be really good. My hard work on the bench paid off, everything fits, and I want to spend just a second to show you how I'm doing the mounting because there is no given way to do this. You, like me, are going to have to jimmy rig something on your engine stand bracket. There is technically a factory engine yoke. It's on the screen right now. They are extremely expensive and extremely rare these days because they're long since discontinued. So if you can find one and you want to pony up the bucks, yeah, that'll work really good. And it also gives you a lot of access to the back area, but you can tell I've already taken off the cover that was on the back of the block that has the rear main seal in it as well. So I'm not really worried about my access at this point. Anyways, once I drilled those holes on the bench, that was because I couldn't reach with these 2 arms here while reaching way out to the bottom. So here's my setup. I have a bracket where there are slots. You're going to need that for sure. I'm using the 2 bolts that were always in this hole up here for those arms. I made 2 holes a little bit higher, and then out on the edges I have really long bolts with a long shoulder, and yes, I am using these bottom ears in the casting. I think that's going to be just fine. Some of you might think that the casting is too far away and too thin out there to hold the weight. I think it's going to be just fine. Same is true on the starter side. I'm using this hole right back down here. I have a long bolt running through this way, and that's kind of it. This thing is on here really, really good. A man I don't really know on the internet in a top secret 4.2 liter WhatsApp group that I'm in once told me that the smartest way to do this is put your engine stand bracket on the back of the block and then lift the engine and slide it into your engine stand, which I'm about to do. Do not try to take this, put it in there, pick your engine off the ground, and then try to lay your hardware into the back of the block while it's swinging around. This way first. The whole thing is off the ground. Oh yeah, genius. Absolute genius advice. Locking pin in. Oh, it's worked. Look at that. Haha. Man, I feel so cool having an engine on an engine stand in the garage, and it's going to be so nice with 360-degree access to work on a motor. That is where it's at. So I've also made myself a little bit of a clean zone here. I don't know how effective it's going to be, but I didn't want to get my new engine stand dirty, so I threw a garbage bag on there. I'm going to take out the oil level sensor in a second and work on the drain pan, and hopefully this just takes care of all the teardown mess that's about to happen. Really, I'm just trying to burn a day here. I've got a bunch of factory tools coming tomorrow in the mail that are going to help me take off some other stuff and work my way towards a short block. Are you ready for some genius advice? Just know that there's oil in the oil pan. Of course, I drained the engine already, but visually you can even see that there's quite a bit of volume below the oil pan drain plug. And although I had my little pan ready to go, I really didn't anticipate how much oil drains out of the block over time when you have it up on a stand and you just haven't been running it for a while. Quite a bit came out, and I wrecked my gloves, and that sucked. Oil pan came off no problem with the help of something I dug out of my painting supplies. This is just like a normal little putty knife, really quite nice and thin. Point is, when you jam it in between the bottom of the block and the oil pan, you won't dig into the metal and potentially, damage it and make it hard to seal later. So this was very helpful, just hammered it around, that did the trick. But honestly, who cares? Because I have my shipment from Snap-on Canada. You can buy factory tools from them, either through Audi or VW. They have 2 portals. And you're getting the real deal when they send out the little card. It looks like this, has got the factory tool number on it, and there's a little diagram in there. And you can also see this logo right here. That's the real stuff. I picked up a number of things. Yeah, it's a little bit more expensive. And my sort of rule of thumb is if I can buy a factory tool for under about $100 Canadian, I usually do it. I know there's stuff probably in your toolbox that will be as good or like at least get the job done. And I've done that before too, trust me. But when I can, I do like to get the factory tool. First up is a very innocuous set of little pliers. Admittedly, these are probably the least useful things that I bought, but they were pretty cheap and I wanted to try them out. They have little dowely pins on the end of them, and I'll show you what they're for. On both the power steering pump pulley and this is the fan clutch pulley, there are these holes inside of here. And this tool is especially helpful if you want to just put the pins in like so, and then you can actually control and hold the pulley wheel still while you actually work on the fasteners that are on the front. I'll just go ahead and get a few of these things off the front of the block, and I will meet you back soon for some more interesting things around the timing belt. In hindsight, this factory tool is super useful, and I'm glad I bought it. That being said, 2 out of the 3 of the fasteners holding the power steering pump pulley in place were seized, so I had to extract those, and then the pulley itself was still stuck and I had to superheat that and knock it off from the back. Then I could take off that big bracket on the front holding the front engine mount and then the power steering pump and its bracket. So I got a little excited after that time lapse, moved on to the next piece of work, and then boom, disaster. My bit that is supposed to be on the end of here, it sheared right off. It is stuck inside of the tensioner pulley assembly right here. So typically what you would do is put an 8mm Allen head bit in there, go counterclockwise, depress this pin in the tensioner itself. Eventually the hole in the tensioner lines up with the hole in the body right here that you probably can't see very well. Slide a pin through it, lock it all down, things get loose, undo this, put on the bar, start working on the cam gears. Mine just absolutely exploded, belt came off, not a huge deal, it's not like I'm gonna reuse any of this. Clearly my tensioner is no good. I couldn't even get it to depress all the way, so I'll have to replace that, knock that out. I'll move on and I'll meet you back here for the removal of the cam gears. All right, we're at a fun part. I wanna make sure that you have a really good view for this because I'm gonna show you how to pull off the cam gear sprocket. Now, what you saw me do was loosen up this bolt in the middle here on both sides, and obviously I don't have the bar on. The workshop manual says to back out the center bolt about 5 turns. And that's gonna be because it's going to be a leverage point for the tool that I need to use to do this. Now, this is actually the only sort of like replica or like knockoff factory tool that I bought because this is simply really, really expensive if you wanna buy it from Snap-on. This is, I think, about 50, 60 bucks on Amazon. I've got the link in the description of this video. And essentially there are a couple of little prongs that are specifically designed to wrap around the little arms in the sprocket and pull back. And of course, like any normal kind of like pulling tool, it uses something in the middle to press against. I'm gonna do this for the first time with you. I haven't test fit or tried it on the other side yet. I'll just call out the fact that the finger width, and I'm talking about the spaces in here, they're actually different sizes. I believe there's a 17 versus a 23 or 25 like spaced finger. I don't know why that's the case. To me, this looks all symmetrical. Don't know why you wouldn't just have 2 the same. Who cares? I'm going to just randomly choose to put it over the bracket like so. Yep, grip feels pretty good. I've already determined that this takes a 17 mil socket to turn. Let's see how it goes. That seems pretty good. Nothing broke, it just simply came off. Oh, that's a long bolt. Cool. Ah, interesting. It's keyed right here, but it's not keyed to the sprocket. It is keyed to, it's keyed to the back of this little bracket right here. With those cam sprockets and belt out of the way, so too followed the tensioner and its pulley. And then I found out that both of the fasteners holding in the timing belt idlers were stripped, so did a quick little extraction on those guys. Meanwhile, I started soaking down everything in penetrating fluid, especially knowing that the water pump was coming up later. But in the meantime, I was able to get off the timing covers and start to reveal the front of the heads, and we're really looking at the V8 now. So went back to the thermostat housing, which came off like a dream, and it's pretty sweet because my ratchet looks like a set of nunchucks when I'm doing it in high speed. I was really lucky that none of the fasteners related to the water pump stripped or broke on the way out, which is common. My final major task on the side of the block was to remove the oil filter housing assembly, which actually has an oil cooler inside of that bracket on the right there. Anyways, the bottom left bolt that I'm working on right now was super stuck and actually really hard to get at, so I did what I always do in this situation, which is I light it on fire and I hope for the best. Eventually I did get that assembly out, and here you can see in the picture that miraculously the oil cooler neck that feeds coolant from the block into the oil cooler was totally intact. That's it, all the accessories are gone, and I'm stopping here to smell the roses a little bit and enjoy my current victory of a stripped down block. We've just got two heads sitting on the block. This is pretty much the epitome of a long block. There's no accessories, with the exception of this damn dipstick tube that I haven't been able to pull out. It's in here so good. It's kind of annoying. It's ruining my victory a little bit. So I'm calling this episode here. I know off the top I said that I'd be doing the full teardown of the head and block with you, and I will, but I've decided I want to shoot it in a totally different format next time. So hang in there. I'm gonna jump into the work literally right away. And thank you for watching. I know this is pretty specific work. This isn't a broad appeal type of video, but I hope to encourage you, as always, if you're watching and you have an A8 or an S8 or maybe a C5, you know, you can do it. Yeah, it's a lot of work and it's gonna fight you probably every step of the way, but it's really rewarding work to do, and I absolutely encourage you to get elbows deep in a project that you think you could have never done before. A final thank you to everyone who chimed in with either words of encouragement in the last two episodes or some ideas about what to look out for or where to take this project, because truthfully, this is gonna be a long project and I'm still in research and I'm still trying to understand where I wanna take certain parts of this build. So I appreciate that information. Keep it coming. Thank you again for watching. Go answer the poll in the community section right now about the vanity plate, and I will see you next time.